So the focus of today's session will be on reading a medical article. And so my hope is by the end of today you will feel comfortable about where to find information relating to a piece of research. And the objectives are that by the end of today, I hope that you are able to identify the different parts of a research article, to know if you want to find out a piece of information, where can you look inside of the article, and then if you want to find out a piece of information and it's not there, how to know if they have not reported some things that they are supposed to report. So there are certain things that should be inside, so how do you know if those things are missing or not? And there's a lot of reasons why I wanted to start here and why it's important that you understand what is inside of an article. So by the time that you are done reading an article, you should be able to explain why they did the study. So what is the gap in information that they are trying to address in their research? What is the value of the study? What can change based on what they have learned? What does it add that we did not know before? The quality of the study. Is it a good study or is it a bad study? Is it generalizable? So the generalizability of the study. And this word generalizability means they learned something in Kenya. Does it apply to other places outside of Kenya? So when I say that something is generalizable, it means that what they learned in that research can apply to other places. So if a study is not generalizable, then it only applies to where the research is done. And if the study is generalizable, then it can apply to other areas outside of the study. And maybe it doesn't apply to all areas. Maybe the study from Kenya is generalizable to Rwanda, but it is not generalizable to Vietnam. Okay, so it applies to other areas outside of where the study was done. If you understand an article, you should be able to discuss what the results were. What did they learn that was new from what they knew before? And then finally, and I really think most importantly, what are the recommendations based on what they learned? So what should be different after doing the research compared to what happened before? So what goes into a research article? Generally, when we talk about articles, we say that there are 4 main sections in a research article. So the 4 main sections that we're going to focus on today in our discussion are the introduction, the methods, the results, and the discussion. 2 other important pieces that will come in an article. One is the references. So if you look at the very end, there's a long list of other articles, and we'll talk about the roles of references in papers. And the other one that is almost always there is the abstract. And that's the very beginning short summary at the start of the paper. So if you look at your paper, the very first set of paragraphs is the abstract, and that is a summary of the entire paper. So if you ever only have 3 minutes, start with the abstract, and then you can decide if you want to read the rest of the paper. Unless it's for the course, and then you have to read the whole paper regardless. So the reason why we talk about the different sections is different sections of the article will contain different pieces of information. So we're going to go section by section, and I'll describe to you what you can expect to see in each section. And this is really going to help you in the future when I start asking you questions about what were the objectives of the study. You know that you should just look into the introduction, and that's where you can find the objectives. Or if I say to you, what were the limitations of the study, you know to look in the discussion, and that's where that information should be. This is also going to help you. My hope for all of you is that within a year, you'll say, I want to do my own research. I want to write my own papers. And so starting to think now about what goes into a paper will help you in the future when you start writing your own papers, okay? So I want you to think about what should be in the paper, so when you start to write your own paper, you know what goes in. And I want to say, writing is an art and it is not a science. So sometimes you might find the objectives in the methods. It does happen. So what I'm going to describe to you today is what happens in most papers. You may find them in other places other times, but mostly this is how the paper will be laid out. And we're going to start with the first section, which is the introduction. So what goes into the introduction? Usually with the introduction, we are trying to set up the scene for the story. We are trying to give enough background to the reader for them to understand why you did the research, for them to understand what the problem was, what the missing piece of information was, and for them to understand the goal for this particular study. So what were they trying to achieve? Generally, it is like a funnel. So first you start with the big picture. What do we know about this problem on the big scale? Globally, what do we know about the problem? And then we try to talk a little bit about the context. So for this case, what do we know specifically about the problem in Kenya? So a little bit more detail about the specific situation where the research is done. And then finally, it typically ends with the objectives. So what was not known, what were the gaps in information that we are trying to answer by doing this study? So if you ever say, I have no idea what they were trying to achieve, generally if you look at the very end of the introduction, there will be a good description of the objectives of what the study was trying to achieve. So in this particular study, a lot of you talked about what you learned from the paper were the things that were already known. So things like HIV infection is associated with circumcision. Information like countries with high HIV prevalence, countries with high HIV prevalence and low rates of circumcision should have circumcision campaigns. So that is information that is known across many countries where there is an HIV epidemic. We know HIV and circumcision are related, and if there is a high HIV prevalence and low circumcision, we should try to advocate for circumcision campaigns. In terms of what was known in Kenya, 80% of men are circumcised, but that there are large variations. So there's some areas of Kenya where many men are circumcised, and there are some areas of Kenya where very few men are circumcised. Overall, 80% of men are circumcised, but it changes area by area. So then what were the gaps? If they already know this, what were they trying to achieve in this study? And this is one of the questions I asked you in your homework. What were the objectives that these authors were trying to achieve in their study? And there were 4 objectives that they put forth. They wanted to know the prevalence of male circumcision, the relationships between demographics and circumcision, the numbers in each circumcision group, so the number who were circumcised, the number who were uncircumcised, and then to talk about how those results impact what they're doing in Kenya. So what are the implications for Kenya's program? Now, a lot of times you will see in the text a statement with a little tiny number at the end of the statement. So you'll see this most commonly in the introduction and the discussion. So here's an example. There is a statement in the introduction that says, of an estimated 33.4 million people living with HIV, approximately 22.4 live in sub-Saharan Africa, and of these, 1.5 million live in Kenya. And then there's a 1. That 1 is a reference to another article. So it wasn't like they were just sitting around and I said, Eileen, how many people do you think have HIV? And she's like, I don't know, 40 million. And I say, how many do you think live in Kenya? She's like, I don't know, 2 million. This is actually coming from a source of information that has been published before. I was going to say it's true. It is possible sometimes that the thing that is published is not true, but they are relying on another published source to get this information. And in this case, the source was a report on the AIDS epidemic from the UN AIDS program. So there's a number 1 at the end of the statement, and if you go to the end of the paper, you'll see the references. The number 1 is where that information came from. Okay. So why do we use references? One is it helps me know what is a fact, so what has been published in other places versus what they think or is an opinion. And then if I want more information, I can go and look up those references to find out more. So for example, if I want to know more about the AIDS epidemic across the world, maybe I'm interested to know what the report says about HIV in Rwanda, I can look at the reference to find information, and I can find that article and read more. Okay, so it's a way to find additional and more information outside of the article. So this paper, if you look, in addition to this one paper, they provide you 19 references that support what they say in the paper, and 19 references where you can look for more information about the topic. Okay? So if you see a paper with very few references, then you might think, is what they are writing true, or is it just their opinion? Okay? And if you see a paper that has very few references, I might say, did they look to see what other people know, or did they just do their own thing without looking for other information? So references are a way that you can judge the quality of a paper. If there are very, very few references, then you might start to be a little bit nervous about the quality. Next comes the method section. And the reason why we have a method section, one is replication. Replication in French. So this allows for the study to be repeated. So if Willie does a study that I think is very interesting, but I'm not sure I believe the results, I can take his methods and I can do it again to see if I get the same result. If Willie does a study and I think it's very interesting and I want to say, hey, do those results apply in Malawi? I can take his methods and repeat the study in Malawi and see if I get the same results. So the methods section should be like a recipe. You should be able to follow it exactly and do what they have done if you want to repeat the study. It should have enough detail that you can replicate what they have done. It also helps you interpret the findings appropriately. So it tells you where did they do the study. It tells you how they chose individuals. And if there's any limitations, you can start thinking about it based on what they have described in the methods. And it is a good way to determine the quality. Is it a good study? Is it a study we believe in? And the generalizability of results. Generally, if I'm looking at the methods, I have a good idea of how generalizable it is. There's a lot of things that go into a method section. So first, a study setting. Where was the study done? Describing, so they have a picture of what is happening there that is unique. So if I was doing a study about heart failure in Ringquavu, I would want to discuss the services provided in Ringquavu. What is the Ministry of Health support? What does PIH do that helps the ministry or adds to the program? And it helps give me a picture of what is unique about that place when they were doing the study. Another thing that they should discuss is the study design. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because starting in 2 weeks, every week we will discuss a new study design. So did they use a cohort study, a cross-sectional study, a case control study, a randomized trial? So we'll talk after this week the different study designs that could be used, and it should be discussed in their methods. Selection of participants. So there's really 2 important pieces of information. Who was eligible or who was not eligible, and how were they chosen to be included? So when they talk about who was included in the study, what I want to know is who was eligible and how were they chosen to be part of the study. If it is an intervention study, they should describe the intervention. So maybe if some groups are going to get the EMR and some groups are not, then you want to describe the EMR in detail so that they understand what the intervention was. Data collection, what information was collected and how was it collected? So HIV status, there's a lot of ways you can collect information on HIV status. I can go to the person and say, are you infected with HIV? I can go to the person and say, can I take your blood so I can test you for HIV? There are different ways to collect information. Some are better than others, and it's important to describe to the reader, how did you get the information you collected? How did you analyze data? And again, we won't go into too much detail right now, but as we go through the course, I'm going to show you different ways to do analysis and present results. So hopefully at the end you have some idea of different ways to analyze data. And then finally, an ethics statement. How did you protect the individuals in the study? How did you make sure if you were studying patients at Ringkwavu Hospital that there was no potential to harm the patients, that they were safe, that their involvement in the study will not hurt them in any way? So the ethics statement describes how you protect the individuals who are included in your study. So in this study that you read, so the study was done in all 8 provinces of Kenya between August and December of 2007. It was a cross-sectional study. A cross-sectional study. And by cross-sectional, I mean I took one picture in time. So I went at one point and I took the data. And we'll learn more about cross-sectional studies in the future, but generally it's a snapshot, a photo, looking at one point in time of what is happening. Population-based. So a lot of times, I would say most of the studies I do are either population-based or clinic-based. Clinic-based studies are studies where you take people who are coming to the hospital or coming to the health center. Population-based studies are when I go into the community and I take people from the community. And we'll talk about next week the strengths and weaknesses of clinic-based studies versus population-based studies. Okay? And if you want more information about how the data was collected, they actually refer to another paper, so you can read reference 12 if you want more information. Selection of participants. So this was one of the questions that I asked you to think about. Who was eligible to be included into the study? So you had to be a man, so you're probably not going to ask a woman if she was circumcised or not in this study, okay? It had to be a man, and they were particularly looking at men between 15 years and 64 years, okay? So those were who were eligible. Another piece of eligibility is it couldn't be any man. The man had to have slept in the house the night before. So it is possible for a man to have been a member of the house, but maybe he works in the city and he was not there the night before, he would not be eligible. And then the next question is, how are they chosen? And we're going to talk about ways to choose people next week. But first of all, they randomly chose areas. So they didn't go to all men in all of Kenya. They randomly chose some areas. So it was like taking the candy out of the bag. You closed your eyes and you chose something out. And then in those areas, they made a list of households and they randomly chose households to include. So they didn't have enough money to go to every household in all of Kenya. So they randomly chose some areas and then they randomly chose some households within those areas. There was no intervention, so there's no description of the intervention. Data collection was done by interviewers. They collected information on demographics, behavior, and circumcision status by self-report. So they went and they asked the person, what is your age? What is your education? Have you been circumcised? They did collect HIV status by self-report. But they also did a blood test to confirm HIV status and to confirm HSV status. Okay, so they did ask, are you infected with HIV? But they also tested the person's blood to see if they were infected with HIV. For data analysis, this reports the things that are included in the paper. They reported the number of men who are not circumcised with certain certainty bounds. They did their analysis in SAS, and then they weighted their data and accounted for survey design. This is what they put in the analysis section. My guess is for some of you, if not all of you, it sounds like want, right? So maybe weighting data or accounting for survey design doesn't mean much now. But stick with me. I promise with you in the next few weeks we'll talk about why we weight data and how we incorporate survey design. So we'll talk about this line more in the coming weeks. And then finally, ethics statement. How did they protect the individuals? What did they do to make sure that the individuals who participated wanted to participate and were protected? So one is informed consent. So generally in informed consent, the consent part is I say, Ancil, do you agree to be in the study? Yes, no. And she has to say yes to be included. The informed part is for her to say yes, I need to tell her why we are doing the study, what is the risk to her, what is the benefit to her, and how I will protect her information during the research. So I need to give her information so she can decide if she wants to participate.
Ask for their permission to participate.
Who approved the study? So in this case, two groups approved the study. The Kenya Medical Research Institute and the CDC. So generally, every person in the study, their institution has to approve the study. So if we do research here in Rinkwavu, the study has to be approved by the National Health Research Committee. And then usually it has to be approved by Harvard University because that is who employs me, or Brigham and Women's Hospital because that is who employs Dr. Hema. So oftentimes we have to get many approvals because people are coming from different institutions. Okay? And I think I said NHRC, the ethics approval in Rwanda comes from the Rwanda National Ethics Committee. So you have to get approvals from all the institutions that hire the people who are involved in the study. And what they do is they look at and they say, I think this is a safe study. I think there will not be more harm than is needed to the person or that the harm is reduced. I think it is a safe study to do, and so we give you permission to go ahead and do it.